So this is a huge episode, and it's been in the works for a long time. The title that I'm going to use is Jake Daubert, the Alchemical Gold Diamonds Forged from Coal. So we're going to get around to the main concept, which is a refinement of character, and the idea of human nature as a forge for the refinement of character. And nothing to me, really, even in modern history, nonetheless baseball history, even going back to kind of the mythological foundations of Western civilization, whether that's Hercules or Perseus or Sisyphus, right? You could look at those mythological archetypes and make a claim and say these are the foundational blueprints that tell us what humanity is about and what humanity means on a spiritual level, right? What the process of human striving, human nature, the evolution of humanity, all of our cultures and civilizations, what we're here for and what we're doing, right? So those archetypes lay a sort of spiritual foundational blueprint. They're the stories that our cultures tell about the meaning of life and the reason for human action, not just in terms of the basic physical and biological excretions, reproductions, consumptions, right? The things that we do to sustain the body as a thermodynamic engine. But furthermore, the reason for that sustenance, right? It's the spiritual bread, so to speak. I think, as Christ put it in the passages. So when we're looking at specifically this phenomenon, I've really zeroed in here on the coal mining towns of the Appalachian in the United States. And I want to say late 1800s, early 1900s. And I have highlighted here, it's a photographic postcard from Shamokin, Pennsylvania. And we've discussed this. This is where both Stan Kowaleski, the first figure that we talked about with this mythic spiritual undertone of the ascent through the mines, comes from, as well as Jake Daubert. So we'll describe Jake Daubert in more detail here, but that postcard depicts a couple of the Breaker Boys, right? And you can see that they're very young. I mean, they must be from the ages of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And they're working with the dinkies. And the dinkies are the transportation trains that would move this coal from the mines and from the collieries. So let me see if I can distill this. It's a very powerful time, not only in human history, but American history, because the movement of global industrialization, as well as the industrialization of America, functions very differently than anything historically. So you have the slavery in the American South, which forms the economic, agricultural foundation, kind of the root infrastructure when you think of early American history. And of course, you're really looking at a history of exploitation, and that slavery in the American South is being performed predominantly by black slaves who have been brought over to the United States via the transatlantic slave trade. When you look at what's actually happening in the Northeast, in this kind of coal mining passage of the Appalachian, predominantly Pennsylvania, stretches of West Virginia, when you're looking at that coal mining passage as a geographical construct and territory, you're looking at these towns that were actually settled predominantly by different European immigrant groups. And they basically immediately descended into these mines and performed these intense tasks in the bowels of the earth to harvest this coal as the energy solution to industrialization. So if you think about it, right, you're entering into a period of time in human history which is a form of metallurgy, right? It's a use of coal, which then in large part just gets transported a little bit down the road, so to speak, to Pittsburgh for the steel production, which is literally the foundation of American industrialization. When you think of the skyscrapers, when you think of the cars, the automobiles, everything from this metallurgy, right? And you can see this metallurgy translate into the creation of advanced computation devices, right? Computers with their chips and the way that they're structured are an advanced metallurgy, an advanced industrial metallurgy, which actually ties directly back to this this the Steel City, right? Again, the Pittsburgh nickname is almost too apt. The Steel City, which undergirds the industrialization of American civilization. So it's a very powerful moment in time in American history, and it's a highly exploitative time. The immigrants that work in these mines work entirely under the jurisdiction of the mine owners, right? So they live in mining towns. They live in coal mining towns. The entire towns themselves, the industry is coal mining, and the money they get or they receive is going to be $1 a week for 12 to 14 hours, maybe $3 a week for 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 hours a day in the mines, especially as a breaker boy, which Daubert and Kovaleski both were at the ages of 11 and 12. They're deep in these mines breaking coal for 14 hours a day. So you're either receiving that dollar amount or you're receiving something called scrip, which is that's company backed money. So you go to the company store, you purchase from within the company infrastructure, and that money doesn't translate anywhere else. So it's a form of deep indentured servitude, really a pretty profound form of slavery, because your entire economic circumstances are tied to your ability to use that money to create difference for yourself. And if you're using a company backed money, all of your work and all of your labor just goes directly back into the company itself. There is no ability to take that money and move elsewhere or go elsewhere or create something elsewhere. And the money in the first place is so little that going or creating something elsewhere is just not possible. So you look at these circumstances, and Jake Daubert is a fascinating figure to discuss this, because you have this incredibly exploitative, especially in terms of child labor, which is what we're zeroing in on with both Daubert and Kovaleski. They're working at ages 11 and 12 in these mines, deep in these dark mines, for over half of the 24-hour day, for all of their days except for one, right, which is probably going to be Sunday there. And you can see, I think with Daubert, it's much more apparent and representative. Kovaleski's character is something we discussed a little bit in previous episodes, but Daubert's character is so profoundly telling because of who he grows up to be. He grows up to be a labor leader in baseball. He grows up to be perhaps one of the most upstanding and outstanding citizens in the arena of baseball itself. Not only standing up for, of course, his personal rights, but standing up for the rights of his fellow ball player. Very closely tied to his community roots, very in tune with a grounded ethical perspective. And you can see, especially when you go into his biography, and I don't want to do it too much here because we're making more of a metaphysical point. You can see when you go into his biography the character that has been forged and the character that's created. And I want to say, of course, some of that comes from the innate person and who you are and your outlook and your perspective and the way that you see things just at a biological or even a spiritual level. But a lot of that, I think, comes from his experiences, right? His experiences in the mines, working with his fellow breaker boys at ages 11 and 12. The amount of hardship that this man truly had to undergo and endure creates someone who actually becomes the fabric in a lot of ways of the end part of dead ball baseball going into the 1920s with the start of the live ball era. You can see the impact that he has. I mean, obviously, he's a very talented player, first of all, but you can see the impact he has in terms of his leadership and his character as it impacts the entire ecosystem of baseball. And that's really what I've focused in on, because it's something that's mentioned so often that it almost unfairly eclipses his achievements on the field. He was never elected to the Hall of Fame, but has a very strong case for that. If not just for his play on the field, but also for his impact as a labor leader, someone who is standing up for his fellow players. So the idea and the concept here is the alchemical gold and working with human nature to refine character. And This goes again with Kovalevsky and the overcoming of this intense, immense hardship that they experienced in these coal mines in the Appalachian in the early 1900s. Um, you see the creation of something like this, and you almost wonder to yourself, what is this? What is this serving humanity other than a monstrosity, right, or a terror? And you look at the things that these young children had to undergo in these mines for such protracted periods of time, right? And many of them would never leave the mines. A lot of the history of the Appalachian in the United States is intergenerational mining. It's parents of parents of parents, all of whom are miners, and they live and work in the mines. And you might be above ground for a couple hours a day when you go to sleep, and then you go right back down into the mines with your crew the next day. And um, from what I've been able to discern and understand, the relationships that are formed in these mines are of profound teamwork and camaraderie and compassion, in terms of, you understand that because of the intense risk, I mean, everything from black lung to mine collapse, because of the intense risk that is endured in these situations, um, it is required that you form a deep bond of compassion and teamwork and create leadership structure in these situations, because of how, not only how protracted the labor is, but how dangerous it is. So the level of awareness and the level of teamwork that needs to be there to accomplish the task is immense, just to survive and make it out of the mines for the next day. And you can see, especially in terms of the foundation of modern American history, how just how immediate the impact of the work in the mines was in terms of harvesting coal, because that's a direct translation. That coal, and without that coal, there is no energy. In terms of an excess of energy that's being harvested from the earth and burned off to create the steel undergirding of the industrial metropolises and cities of America and the technologies of America, which allowed it to industrialize and become a world power. Without this, really, I'll just call it an essential human sacrifice on a collective level of hundreds of thousands of mine workers who are doing this work of going deep into the earth and harvesting this coal, which is then being fed to the belly of this massive machine, which is the industrial superpower of America. That's the war machine. That's the ships. That's the planes. That's the machine of the cities, which is the tenement architecture and the factories that are created along with their machinery, right? We're really looking at, you trace the depth of modern American history and you find it with these 11 and 12-year-old breaker boys in these coal mines in the early 1900s. And when you look at that, there's obviously a massive, massive ethical dilemma. And my real appreciation is baseball history, because it allows for, through culture, to really see and perceive a human being and what they accomplish in themselves, right? Because you can obviously, again, we talked about this, looking at the stats, but that's just, it's nothing. You're looking at these people who have dedicated themselves to the craft of baseball and refined their character through it. And the Lou Gehrig analogy that we gave before in terms of the spiritual discipline of the game is one thing. But Jake Daubert, in terms of literally the character that is so clearly manifested and asserted in the public sphere, and the relationship of that character to the experiences he underwent and the perspectives that he developed through the hardship of those experiences is far too much of a synchronized movement than it could possibly be a coincidence. And of course, these things can't be known in history, right? We're speculating on the experiences that Jake Daubert had deep in these coal mines beyond the more generalized descriptions that he gave historically in terms of first-person autobiographical description, as well as the historical descriptions that have been provided of the lives of breaker boys, specifically in the Pennsylvania and West Virginia coal regions, right? But what we're looking at is again something kind of metaphysical and complex in terms of the alchemical gold of the human being, and the concept, right, which here is almost too apt and too literal, of the diamond being forged from the coal of the human being, because the human being really is just a composite of molecules and elements, right? A compound, an evolutionary device, and a genetic technology and a genetic language that's been developed over millions of years. You're looking at something that, if you were going to take an existential philosophical lens, is a development of history and of nature that doesn't necessarily have any inherent meaning other than that evolutionary process of change, as just a natural unfolding of the universe. But then you take through the lens of that experience what is produced and what is cultivated, and that is just primarily going to be character. It's going to be disposition. It's going to be perspective. It's going to be through the pressure and change and force of history and the engagement with history and time. The individual naturally and necessarily changes, and it's a question of whether or not we're authentically engaging those pressures and pivot points of change. And Jake Daubert, to me, is really just a perfect place and perfect person to really look at this engagement with change and who and what was forged through it. I mean, this is a man who was born into perhaps some of the most difficult circumstances that can be conceived of in human history. You're essentially enslaved to the mines until further notice from birth, right? This is a circumstance of birth. His father, I believe, was in the mines, and so were his brothers, and one of his brothers actually died in the mines very early on. So he's in a situation where this is his past, present, and future, and it's a circumstance of birth. And through, much like Kovaleski, the cultivation of his baseball skill, he attracts the attention of a semi-pro team, and then eventually, of course, becomes professional, and goes on to have a career where he wins an MVP award, multiple batting titles. He's known as the best defensive first baseman in the National League. Right, just numerous achievements in the realm of baseball, on top of being, again, a labor leader, right? Someone who is organizing and supporting his fellow player in this game. So that, again, that rise through these circumstances of incredible difficulty, with Daubert a little more so than Kovaleski, I'd say, evinces or shows us the power of what is possible in such a circumstance or such a position, and who people can and do become through this crucible of hardship, through this crucible of pressure and force of change, to which many, right, just by circumstances of birth, are not ever put in the position of having to experience. And the power of witnessing that, as a fellow human being, is something that says we're starting to understand a little more what the essence of being human is, and the essence of meaning and cultivating meaning is in being human. So there's the concept of the alchemical gold, or the great work, and this is the whole idea of turning the body, so to speak, from lead into gold. And really what this is it's a purification or purgation through the cultivation of virtue and self-mastery and self-knowledge, self-realization. It's a spiritual process through which the body is the alembic, or the container, or the vessel, to achieve higher and greater states of perfection and self-knowledge and discipline and truth. And this is something that I think is rarely visible in a historical sense, which again is why at the outset of this talk here, I was bringing up Hercules and Perseus and Sisyphus, because these are all symbolic, archetypal representations of this process of the perfection of humanity or mankind, this striving towards virtue, which in the Greek is termed arete. It's the striving towards virtue for virtue's sake, and thus is a purification of the natural world or the material world. You don't really see that historically. A lot of what's visible historically is the striving toward material gain, right? It's the history of the conqueror, the history of the megalomaniac, so to speak, in terms of an obsession and infatuation with the surfaces, with the material world, right? But not just the appearances, right? It's the shadows on the wall. It's not the actual spiritual fire itself. Kind of allude to Plato. It's what we're really working with is the fire, right? It's not the apparitions that we become enamored with and thus pursue endlessly and waste our lives in distraction. We're working with that real fire of spiritual transformation and the gold that's rendered out of that lead, or even that process, if you want to think of smithing, right? It's this process of using that gold as, or using that coal as an engine to transform and do metallurgy, right? This metal work that we're seeing happen industrially, I think realistically is a subconscious revelation on a physical level of the spiritual work that humanity is doing, or that we need to do, which we've kind of lost sight of in the modern world. That process of forging in a spiritual sense is the metabolism of experience, the metabolism of transformative events. And you could call that trauma, you could call that change, you could call that force of nature, you could call that the spirit of history and time. But it's the metabolism of that. And what Daubert experiences is a very extreme version of that kind of metabolism. The metabolism of that and the creation of the alchemical gold or the spiritual gold of the character through that process. So this is a very kind of like esoteric and hidden and metaphysical device that's active in human history constantly. And it's something that is obscure in the sense that the fruits, the spiritual wealth that's rendered from it is not always immediate or visible or apparent, because it's something that's carried or worn. It's like a garment in the soul, so to speak, right? It's something that's carried or worn in the literal aperture and apparatus of the character itself. It's who we are and who we become. It's not what we have and what we thus show off, right? It's something that's much more internal and thus essential. So the experience of that process, it almost is too strange in the sense that, again, the literal metaphor of the coal mines and the industrial force of them, and the coalition of Jake Daubert's experience, as well as Kowaleski, but here particularly Daubert, the coalition of his experience in these mines and the process through which the experience in the mines is metabolized, and he cultivates this skill and the discipline of character and practice, and this skill inevitably leads him into an entirely different life. But the ethic, the ethic itself, right? The ethic of his being that is forged in these minds, which is forged actually early on in his childhood. That ethic not only remains but grows stronger, especially in the engagement with a world which can't really conceptualize that. He famously has a dispute with the owner of the Brooklyn team, Charles Ebbets, who then trades him to the Cincinnati Reds. And I think that dispute really boils down to a higher state and nature of character that Daubert has that Ebbets simply does not. Ebbets is in the business of making money and operating his baseball team like a business, which is all well and good, but it's a superficial form of engagement compared to where Daubert's coming from. He's coming from the mentality and ethos of a mine worker. He's coming from the ethos of collaboration and teamwork and lifting up his fellow human being to accomplish an insurmountable task. So the amount of spiritual strength and courage that's cultivated in the forge of Daubert's soul is something that's profoundly otherworldly in comparison to this kind of nitpicking and petty microscopic business world of baseball, because the way that Daubert sees and perceives the world is through really a spiritual ascent through hardship into the cultivation of a profound state of excellence, which he's actually holding within him as a state of being, and thus is manifesting around him everywhere that he goes. And that state of nature is incredibly profound and powerful, not only to embody but to encounter, because it's a change agent. Much of our world, again, especially the modern world, functions on superficial terms. It's entirely materialistic, self-obsessed, or solipsistic. It's just totally in relation to itself, and thus submerged in the ego. But you have a figure like Daubert, whose relationship to life and collaboration and humanity is formed and sculpted in such a profound and brutal environment of really survival and the necessity of collaboration, and the necessity of really encountering oneself at the deepest, most essential level to accomplish a Herculean task. That perspective is fulminated in him. It's like fulminated in the course of his being, and that's not something that's left behind, but it's something that's rather carried forward in a more profound, transformative form in nature progressively over time. So again, this is not to say by any means that Daubert's work in the mines was a gift by nature, but in many ways it was a profound spiritual gift that Daubert was able to transform that experience into a level of ethics and morality and consciousness, which is very simply not seen. And it's not seen because the transformative measure is never broached, nonetheless met in most people's lives. So when we're talking about a spiritual poverty, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking not only about the spiritual poverty is not only the lack of the experience of struggle in a true foundational essential nature, whether that's struggling with your humanity, struggling with a circumstance, that essential struggle, which is it's almost kind of Job-like in its biblical nature, that essential struggle with life itself and creation and meaning and the force required to achieve or live, whatever it is. The lack of that encounter, but furthermore, the failure to rise through it, the failure to metabolize that profound struggle and experience into the alchemical gold of the soul, right? That's the actual process of turning the lead into gold. You have to actually turn the coal into gold. That process is the transformative nature of the self-encounter. And so that failure, when we look at the macroscopic environment and view and perspective of modernity and modern life, what we're looking at is a mass failure of our spiritual education, right? Because it's an infatuation with self, it's surface level images, it's the accumulation of wealth, all of these things that are just, it's purely in the material realm, and they come into being and they die away and nothing is left because there was no essence within them, right? And this is the spiritual foundation that humanity has lost across all of our civilizations and cultures. The Mayans, the Aztecs, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Native Americans, all of these civilizational forms and tribes actually had a spiritual technology, which were the stories, which was the cultural artifact, the ledger that described in metaphorical, metaphysical, archetypal terms this experience, what it is to undergo the transformative event, right? Whether that's Persephone in Greece, we talked about her, Inanna in Sumer, ancient Sumer, we talked about her. These are stories that, and even Christ, when we talk about Christ going into the cave, these were stories that were the foundation. They were the undergirding of our collective consciousness as a culture or as a group, and they're world stories. When you look at them structurally and infrastructurally, they're world stories, all of which are just telling us the story of humanity through a different cultural lens in terms of the real spiritual work that we're doing and that we're here to do. And the loss of that foundation is catastrophic, because you strip that spiritual ground of the real meaning of the self and the real meaning of life and the real work of life from the collective consciousness. And what you've entered into is really an entirely numbed emptied and silenced world of just empty and meaningless pursuits, which of course that perspective is then reflected in the collective consciousness. It's a empty and meaningless endeavor to be human and to do anything related to being human. It's pointless, effectively, other than to make money and achieve superficial things to gratify the emptiness that is modern life or modernity, right? So you're looking at this critical point here, and I think this really gets us there, is that you're looking at this critical point where this is the onset of modernity. These coal mines are the onset of modernity in the most literal industrial way. This is the furnace of modernity. This is the energy that modernity is scaffolding itself off of in terms of its physical power and force. All of the machines that are being built are coming from this process of mining. This literal moment in time, you're actually seeing a shift in the archetypal aperture of human history and civilization. Jake Daubert himself, the historical figure living this real life, becomes the literal embodiment of Hercules, really without any fanfare even. It's almost like a hidden, obscure, esoteric realization of the spiritual story of humanity in the most literal way possible through these coal mines and the ascent, literal ascent through the initial descent into the mines as a young child, deep, deep, deep into the earth, the ascent upward from that essential trap or cage or pit or prison of whether you want to call that incarnation in a metaphysical way or just the literal circumstances of his life, the ascent through that brutal process into the spiritual gold, which he then carries with him into the rest of his life, into baseball, into the way that he treats others, into the way that he conceives of equity, fairness, and justice and actively advocates for them. You're looking at the spiritual transformation of a soul through the profound event of the descent into, you could call it the descent into hell, realistically, because these circumstances are and were hell. So when you look at that descent narrative, it's so fascinating because you're looking at this critical point in the creation of modernity, which is precisely when we lose this mythic structure which undergirds our understanding of the spiritual nature of humanity. This is what Nietzsche warns about in the late 1800s, the late 1800s, when he says God is dead and we have killed him. He's warning us that our spiritual infrastructure, our collective consciousness, our culture narratives around spiritual transformation are dead, and they're dying in the name of this new world of modernity, which is globalization under technology, under industrial technology, which is radically terraforming and changing our concept of the spiritual self. All of our localized and regionalized spiritual myths, all of which were actually really the same because they're just describing humanity and the spiritual process of transformation that comes with being human. All of those local myths are being obliterated in the name of a homogenized, industrialized, hyper-productive society that's based around material and materialization. It's based around things, production and consumption of things, surfaces, production and consumption of images, right? So we've entranced ourselves in this spell of modernity. We've lost the real spiritual ground. But even as this process is happening, just as it's being initiated in a massive, spiking level and way, you have this figure like Jake Daubert who appears in this very quiet way. It's almost like a hidden way until it's revealed, until it's seen and recognized and understood. As a 11-year-old kid in the coal mines in Shamokin, Pennsylvania, in a coal mining town, coal mining parents, coal mining siblings, who rises through this process of profound spiritual alchemical transformation, rises through this literal process, working in these mines as breaker boy, and achieves not just right the things that he achieves in baseball. Sure, that's a part of it, but it's just a representation. It's the superficial representation of the real work that's done in the soul, the real essence. He achieves this level of alchemical gold, which is so clear in the historical records of who Jake Daubert is and was, is so clear because he stands up. His character is standing up. not only for himself, but for others, right? In a massive and profound way, in a highly conscious way, where he's standing and he's having this conversation with Charles Ebbets, and he's saying, I know what you're doing, and I don't stand for this. I don't condone this exploitation of my fellow people, fellow players here, right? It's almost the rise into a prophetic role. I think of in this way, Moses is a similar archetype, a leadership at a group level, which is a leadership demanding justice and equity and fairness in the name of the real truth of what it is to be human. And to know what it is to be human is to know yourself. And to know yourself, you have to descend. You have to descend into that incarnation. You have to descend into the bowels of hell, the depths of the three-dimensional physical material body with all of the strangeness and unknownness of what it is to be human. You descend into incarnation and you learn about yourself in the depths and the pit of that darkness, and you rise up through it into the light, and thus achieve a level of prophetic leadership, which is historically, that's the Bible, or that's Greek mythology, or that's the Egyptian Book of the Dead, right? These are the guidebooks, and they're the ways, right? The spiritual ways. But as you see, right, so powerfully at this crux of modernity, you have the historical appearance in just such a literal way, in such a hidden way, of a figure that is embodying and walking that path of the way, right? I just think it's fascinating that it happens right at this crucible of this moment of the death of the agrarian, tribal, fractured and fractal human cultures and societies, all of which have their own narratives, right, and their own stories around creation and transformation and the human soul, right? As that is breaking down into a profound primordial unification under the industrial technology, which becomes globalization throughout the 20th century, right? As that's happening, you have such a literal and clear and obvious representation of the metaphysical structure of all of these descent and ascent narratives in terms of the spiritual development of the soul, in terms of the alchemical gold of the human being and of the self, just being embodied in this man, Jake Daubert, who worked in the coal mines when he was 11 years old and experienced a radically transformed and transformative life through his discipline, his presence, and his awareness and his compassion for his fellow human being. So that's what I got here. Very powerful episode, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.